Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining. It's 12:30 on the 9th of September. You've obviously got nowhere better to be than here, which is what we like. So yeah, thank you. So just I guess just quick housekeeping rules. You should be able to see the slides on screen. If not, do drop a message into the chat box. If there are any issues, of course, do drop a message into the chat box. We were just going to ask as well with regards to questions, I suggest that they go into the chat box as well. And then what we'll do, we will allow enough time at the end so that everybody can ask the relevant questions. A copy of the slides will be sent to everybody after the presentation as well. And our details are on there as well. So actually, if you need to ask any questions thereafter, that's fine as well. I understand also a recording of the webinar will also be available on the CICES YouTube channel. So again, it should all be accessible for you thereafter. So as I said, welcome. I'll just do a quick intro. I'm actually on the first one in from the right. My name's David, and I work for Lockton. I'm joined by my illustrious colleague, Jess Snowdon. I feel as if I'm doing a news broadcast. And I'm also joined by the very switched on, very intellectual, and with their fingers on the pulses of all things BSA and DPA, Tim Claremont and Gavin Hocum.
Afternoon, everybody.
And Tim and Gavin work for Browne Jacobson, who we work with quite closely. And yeah, I think obviously their insights on the DPA and BSA and all of those things are going to be very insightful for the audience here. So without further ado, we will kick off. Just quickly, with regards to what is professional indemnity insurance, I realise that there's going to be a mixture of people on this particular webinar, and so we don't necessarily need to go too much into the weeds here, but just with that in mind, we just wanted to give a quick overview of what it is, what it's all about. So yes, we as Lockton, we place professional indemnity insurance because we are a firm of insurance brokers. We are the largest independent insurance broker in the world. We place professional indemnity for surveyors, listers, you name it. We probably do it professional services companies, which is traditionally who buys it. It indemnifies the insured against any claim made against the insured by a third party, that third party having to be an independent third party. So I always think of it as losses whereby you've given advice, anything that you write down or comes out of your mouth or ultimately is professional advice. And that is what the professional insurance is covering. That third party has to demonstrate that they have suffered a financial loss, and it has to have been in the course of the insured's professional services. If all of those parameters are met, then yes, it's a professional indemnity insurance claim, and your professional indemnity insurance will kick in. Obviously, for this audience, probably the most obvious claim is something to do with a design or a specification on a particular project. PI is a claims made policy, so it's the cover that you've got in force at the time a claim is notified against you that will come into effect. That's quite a key point just in the context of what we're talking about here, because most other insurance policies are written on what we call a claims occurring basis, which is the opposite. So things like your car insurance and things like public liability, employees liability, etc. Professional indemnity insurance is quite different because it's the cover that you have in force today. So you're only as good really as the cover you've got here today, even though you might have done the work 6 or 7 years ago. We've just put a side note there. It is mandatory for many organisations and bodies, the SRA, so Solicitors Regulation Authority, ARB for architects, RICS for surveyors. There are some sort of interesting, I suppose, anomalies there when I look at contractors, for instance. Technically speaking, I don't think there's an actual body that dictates they must buy professional indemnity insurance, but they tend to because, of course, they're offering professional services, but also because of what they sign up to in contracts. So the most famous professional indemnity insurance claim in the world, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, as you can tell there. As far as I'm aware, no one was ever sued for that, and there were no ever claims paid out, but I assume had the architect carried PI, it would have been an issue. But why would a PI claim arise? So yeah, an allegation of wrongdoing in the course of your professional services, design, specifications, errors, late delivery of service, I think is a common one. These are all generic examples, I would suggest, of whereby we see professional indemnity insurance claims arising. But I guess the point of this is it all links back to professional services. So it's design, it's specification. Professional indemnity insurance policies also cover any sub-consultants, so people that you've appointed. So that's important to remember as well, that ultimately whereby you are vicariously liable for people, then you could quite easily fall foul of a professional indemnity insurance claim by virtue of somebody acting upon your behalf.
Just a quick one on the current market conditions. I think this is one that everyone's quite eager to hear about, although not related to the BSA per se, but we are still very much in the soft market. So we are seeing rate reductions at the, or rate decreases still at the minute compared to what you will have experienced in the last few years. We're still seeing more entrants from MGAs. Whilst we have too many, they still want to keep coming into the market. So we are still seeing a lot of MGAs, which is also making the market very competitive at the minute. And as a result of that as well, we are seeing wider cover because insurers are having to compete and premiums are very low. So they're trying to offer additional covers to try and make it better on their competitors. At the minute. So, and the majority of cladding and fire safety notifications have crystallised, not all, but the majority have, which means that insurers are starting to be more comfortable about offering wider cover in that respect, or at least actually offering cover in respect of some of you which may have historically not had it. What are we seeing currently in the PI market? As I basically just said, the rates are remaining very competitive. So we are still seeing the low premiums that you hopefully would have experienced last year compared to what you would have experienced a few years before that. With the entrance of the new MGAs coming in, it is making it a very competitive market at the minute, and insurers do like to outdo each other. So we are seeing quite a few insides of that. Another thing that we are seeing, as well as broader cover, is increased line sizes. So whereas before you might have experienced your policy split between a few different insurers, they're now split with just one insurer or two rather than 4 or 5. And they're also increasing the limits that they could cover. So whereas before it might have been restricted to 2 million, now they're looking at doing 5 million. I would like to caveat that that is not all insurers though, and it depends very much on the risk as to what they can do. One of the things that we are seeing a lot as well at the minute is on aggregate and unlimited reinstatements cover. We are starting to see that actually some insurers are starting to offer any one claim rather than aggregate and unlimited reinstatements, which is a really good thing to see. As things are always changing, depending on global events, life, and just the economy, we've now got the Building Safety Act, which we will move on to in a minute. Basically, with this one, it has shown quite a few different things that have come to light. The new principal designer role is quite a key thing, and insurers are still looking at that, and depending on what happens with claims, that may impact. And then the big one as well is the extension of the limitation period for defective. So without further ado, let's pass over to Tim and Gavin, and they can discuss this in more detail. Gavin, are you there?
I am here. Tim, are you still online?
What have we lost him at? Or we might have lost him.
No, we lost him, I think, have we?
Yeah, possibly. Shall we skip ahead to my slides and come back, because it probably doesn't make much difference whether I go first or Tim goes first.
Good idea. You see, this is what professionals do. Is
yeah, back a bit.
Sorry, where was I?
Another one more, I think. Oh, forward. That one. Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Gavin Hockham. Oh yes, Tim, you're back.
I am sorry, I don't know what happened. I dropped off, and for some reason, my camera is now disconnected and my audio was lost for a bit as well. So my apologies, everyone. So Gavin, we can go back if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, everyone. So whilst the slides are scrolling back through, so my name's Tim Claremont. I head up the construction team here at Browne Jacobson. So I work both for the construction industry and then also for insurers, doing both coverage and defence work. And as you might expect, I've spent a lot of my time over the past 8-9 years or so dealing with fire safety issues, both from a coverage perspective and then also dealing with claims, including directly against insurers under the Third Party Rights Against Insurers Act 2010. So Gavin and I are here to talk to you about the Building Safety Act. So we're going to split this into two parts. So I'm going to start by very briefly looking at the legislation itself, and then we're going to go on to look at the way in which the courts have approached claims in relation to fire safety, focusing on the two claims that you can see in front of you. So that's Martlets and Mullally, and then URS and BDW. And then Gavin is going to look at the practical issues arising in relation to new higher risk buildings. So as I mentioned at the start, we'll take questions at the end. One thing I do need to flag now is that we haven't got long. So this is going to be us taking a high level look at the issues and flagging points for you to think about rather than a deep dive into anything in particular. So thanks, Jess, for flicking the slides on. So the Building Safety Act itself, I understand that knowledge on this webinar may vary considerably. So we're going to look at this briefly, and my apologies for those of you who are already well versed in this. So the main changes introduced by the BSA relate to the Defective Premises Act 1972. When the Building Safety Act came into force, there were changes set out in relation to the Building Act also, and those were going to be significant, but they've not yet been brought into force, and most people now think that they won't be. So we'll press on and look at the DPA itself only. So Jess, if you could flick the next slide, please. So there are important obligations in the DPA which existed before the Building Safety Act came into force, and to understand the changes, we need to understand Section 1 of the DPA itself. So as you can see on the screen, Section 1 of the DPA requires that anyone taking on work for or in connection with the provision of a dwelling has to make sure that the work is done in a workmanlike or professional manner with proper materials, such that the dwelling will be fit for habitation when completed. So this obligation is owed to the person or entity for whom the dwelling was originally constructed, as well as their successors in title and people who acquire an interest in it, such as a landlord or a tenant. So there are two key points to note. First, the obligation relates only to the provision of a dwelling. So in other words, work in relation to office blocks won't be caught. Secondly, the obligation relates only to the creation of a new dwelling, so that can be an entirely new build property, the conversion of an existing building into a dwelling, or the extension of an existing building to create a new dwelling or dwellings. So we'll return to that in a moment. So Jess, if you could flick the slides again, please. So the second bit is the dwelling has to be fit for habitation when completed. The courts have considered this, and it's worthwhile pausing on this now so that we can understand how wide this is. So the building has to be, on completion, without remedial works being carried out, capable of occupation for a reasonable time, without risk to the health or safety of the occupant, and without undue inconvenience. So, for example, if you've got a lift in a tower block and that's poorly installed so that it frequently breaks down, it may well be that the apartments on the higher floors are unfit for habitation. You can also look at the aggregate effect of defects. They can render a dwelling unfit for habitation. And similarly, a defect which means that the condition of the dwelling is likely to deteriorate over time, so that when at a certain point in time, it might be unfit for habitation, that will in fact render the dwelling unfit for habitation at completion. It's also worth flagging that defects which are purely superficial in nature will not render a dwelling to be unfit for habitation, but it is relevant that a dwelling is intended to be a new build property and modern in design, and that will be fact sensitive. So Jess, if we could flick on to the next slide, please. So what did the Building Safety Act do? This introduced a new section 2A. So this imposes an additional obligation on people or entities that take on work in relation to any part of a building that contains dwellings. So this is an important extension because it extended the obligations in the DPA beyond the creation of new dwellings to include work undertaken in relation to existing dwellings. In other words, refurbishment works and maintenance works are now also caught. So Jess, next slide, please. So the next bit that I want to look at are the well-publicised changes made in relation to limitation by the Building Safety Act. So these changes came into effect on 28 June 2022, as did the change I just spoke about in relation to the new section 2A of the DPA. So the position in terms of limitation is different depending upon whether the right to make a claim accrued before or after 28 June 2022. So if the right to bring an action accrued after the changes made in the Building Safety Act came into force, the Building Safety Act changed the Limitation Act 1980 so that a claim could be brought within 15 years of the date on which the right of action accrued. So that's a pretty significant change because your standard position under a normal contract is 6 years from when the right of action accrued, or 12 years if that's by deed. There are separate changes if the right of action accrued before the Building Safety Act came into force. So for those claims, the limitation was extended retrospectively with the effect that a claim could be brought in relation to any dwellings that were completed up to 30 years before the Building Safety Act came into force. So that's any point after 28 June 1992. So these are obviously pretty significant extensions, both in terms of the extent of liability and also the period within which a claim can be brought. So with that in mind, let's turn to look at some of the case law. So Jess has already helpfully flicked us on to Martlett Homes and Mullally. So this case was important because it was the first High Court judgment concerning fire safety defects after the Grenfell Tower disaster in 2017. So judgment in this matter was given in 2022. So the claimant was Martlett Homes, the owner of 5 tower blocks in Gosport. Martlett sought to recover some £8 million in damages from the defendant building contractor Mullally. So those costs related to the investigating and remedying of a combustible cladding system, and then providing a waking watch as a fire safety precaution until the cladding had been removed and replaced. So interestingly enough, Martlett admitted that there were some defects in the installation of. So you might ask why the claim hadn't settled. The important point is that Mullally denied that its installation breaches caused either the need to completely replace the cladding or the need for the waking watch. And that's the reason why this went to trial. So as you'll see from the slide in front of you, the court found broadly in favour of Martlett, rejecting Mullally's various defences, and the court held that both the installation and design of the cladding had been defective. So it's worth looking at why the court rejected Mullally's various arguments, because it will paint a picture in terms of the difficulties of defending a fire safety claim. So first of all, the court held that there was no evidence that the cladding had been subjected to a BS 8414 test, or any evidence that Mullally had concluded that the chosen cladding so obviously complied with the fire performance design principles that compliance with the relevant performance standard was not required. The court went on to say that Mullally's reliance on third-party certificates to prove that it had done what it should have done could not be said to amount to a guarantee or passport to compliance with building regulations. It did not. The court then rejected Mullally's arguments that Mullally had not been negligent because every other designer had made the same or a similar mistake at the relevant point in time. So you might call this the lemming defence. The court held that a defendant is not exonerated simply by proving that others were just as negligent. The court went on to look at Mullally's arguments regarding the burden of proof. Mullally had said that it was for Martlett as the claimant to prove that the system as specified would have failed to pass the relevant performance criteria. And the court rejected this, saying that this sought to reverse the burden of proof. Instead, it was for Mullally to prove that the system would have passed the relevant test, which is the BS 8414 test I mentioned a moment ago. The court went on also to reject Mullally's arguments that the cost of the waking watch were too remote to be recovered in damages. The court said, court gave this very short thrift, saying that the need for temporary safety measures was entirely foreseeable. So I've run through all of that incredibly quickly, but hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the problems that you'll face defending a fire safety claim. Finally, I want to look at URS and BDW. So this was a Supreme Court decision from May of this year, and judgment was highly anticipated because the issues included important points of principle regarding the operation of the Building Safety Act, and it was the first time the Supreme Court had commented on such issues. So as you may know, BDW is a major developer, and its brand names include the likes of Barratt Homes and David Wilson Homes. URS, meanwhile, is a consultant engineering services company. So in late 2019, BDW discovered design defects in 2 sets of high-rise residential building developments for which it had been the developer and URS had provided structural design services. In 2020 and 2021, BDW carried out remedial works to those developments, despite the fact that at that point in time, no claim against BDW arising out of the defects had been made or even intimated. Regardless, BDW claimed the cost of the remedial works together with associated costs from URS. So one thing I need to flag at the start is that the Supreme Court's decision proceeded on a set of assumed facts. So the assumed facts included the fact, for example, that the existence and severity of defects at the property and that the defects existed as a result of URS's failure to exercise reasonable skill and care in design. So I need to make clear that those are assumed facts, and of course, in the actual trial between URS and BDW, those facts, I imagine, will be pretty fiercely contested. So we can expect BDW, for example, to allege that in fact the existence and severity of the defects aren't as bad as said, etc., etc. So this is a decision in principle only, but it is still important. So as Jess has just moved us on, so we've got these 4 points of principle. So the first point was URS said that because BDW had voluntarily undertaken the remedial works, it was not able to recover the damages. The Supreme Court rejected that argument, and it said, first of all, there is no concept of a voluntariness principle. And it also went on to say that in any event, it was strongly arguable that BDW had not performed the repairs voluntarily, in particular because of the risks of personal injury or death to the homeowners, for which BDW might have been legally liable. The second point was, does Section 135 of the Building Safety Act apply? And if so, what was its effect? So this is the change to limitation that we looked at earlier. So the parties agreed that Section 135 does apply to claims brought under Section 1 of the DPA. What was in dispute was whether it also applied to claims which are dependent on the time limit under the DPA, but not actually brought under the DPA. And the Supreme Court confirmed that Section 135 of the Building Safety Act does apply to those claims. Thirdly, URS, there was a question as to whether URS in fact owed a duty to BDW under the DPA. The Supreme Court confirmed that it did. It said there was no reason why a developer cannot both owe a duty and be owed a duty under the DPA. Finally, there was a question as to whether BDW was entitled to bring a claim against URS under the Contribution Act. The Supreme Court confirmed that it could. The precise details there are pretty complex, so given time, we'll move on. Jess, if we could have the next slide, please. So let's just look at the comment and the direction of travel. It's pretty clear with the URS decision, as in fact with the Martlett decision, that there's a large element of policy here. So it's notable that in the URS and BDW decision, that the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government made written submissions to the court. And in fact, the Supreme Court described those submissions as particularly helpful. So in keeping with this, the Supreme Court commented with regard to ground 2 of the appeal, that a central purpose and policy of the Building Safety Act in general, and section 135 in particular, was to hold those responsible for building safety defects accountable. So what we've got here is the court saying in terms that the purpose of the Act is to hold people responsible for building safety defects, and that it will use the Building Safety Act to do precisely that. The second point that I want to flag is to do with limitations of liability. So the Supreme Court decision makes clear that any limitation of liability clause, so whether that's an exclusion or a cap on liability or a net contribution clause, will not be effective to the extent that the works in question are caught by the DPA. So what we anticipate off the back of this is that claimants will from now on seek to allege not only that there are defects, but also that those defects make in relation to a dwelling, and that the defects left the dwelling unfit for habitation. So that will be important because it will mean the claimant will be able to avoid any limitation or exclusion of liability. So we expect there, as a result of that, to be satellite litigation, and that will be the extent to which there are dwellings. So for example, a block of flats is a dwelling, but an office building is not. But we expect there will be test cases regarding, for example, is student accommodation a dwelling and are care homes a dwelling? And we also think there will be test cases regarding what losses are covered by the DPA. So for example, can you recover loss of profits under the DPA? So that's been a super quick canter through some pretty complex issues. What I'll now do is pass over to Gavin, who will take a look at some practical issues in terms of new high-risk buildings.
Yeah, good afternoon all. Thanks, Tim. I'm Gavin Hockham. I'm also a partner in the construction team at Browne Jacobson, and I'm a part of the leadership of our cross-discipline building safety group, which supports clients nationally to assess and respond to the risks presented by the Building Safety Act and the associated regulation. I'm in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so going to give you a brief overview of some of the practical implications relevant to the design and construction phase for any building type that have come into force post implementation of the Building Safety Act. The starting point for this is that whilst the Act has been in force now for over 3 years, there remains a misconception that the provisions that have been introduced through the building regs and the higher risk building regulations are relevant only to the design and construction of the tallest of residential towers, and that the issues are primarily concerned with the resolution of legacy cladding claims. That though is very much a misconception. The changes that have been implemented to the building regs in particular from a procedural perspective affect the design and carrying out of building work to buildings of all size and all type. There are simply additional regulations for what are defined as higher risk buildings. Subject to a range of exceptions, a higher risk building, or an HRB, is a building in England which is at least 18 metres in height or has 7 stories, and in either case contains 2 residential units, is a care home or is a hospital. As I said, there are a range of exceptions, and there are also complicated provisions regarding how you measure height, how you count stories, and what happens where you have a range of different structures that interface with one another, where one or more of those structures may satisfy the definition of HRB, but other parts of the structure may not. To add an additional layer of complexity, a different definition applies in Wales, which is that the residential unit threshold in the second limb of that definition is reduced to 1 residential unit, and children's homes are also included in that second limb. There continues to be an ongoing discussion as to whether or not the height and story threshold will be reduced in England, and it looks relatively certain that it will in time in Wales. With that starting point then in mind, there is a baseline layer of regulation relevant to the design and construction of all building types, with simply some additional regulation for higher risk buildings. I'll step you through what some of the corresponding changes mean from a practical perspective. I understand from the membership that more often than not, I suspect, you will be involved at an early stage in delivery, certainly through the design phase, and less so perhaps through the construction phase. It may nevertheless be the case that from time to time, members might have cause to engage with building control, and the Act has created the building safety regulator as the top of the building control hierarchy for the regulation of the building control profession, and also to carry out the building control function in relation to higher risk buildings. In Wales, the equivalent functions of the building safety regulator are to be delivered by the Welsh ministers, who in turn have essentially delegated the corresponding responsibilities to local authorities. The building control function, or rather the delivery of the building control function for non-high risk buildings, hasn't changed, in that it's still delivered through local authority building control and the private building control providers, save that we now have the regulated profession of registered building control approvers, which has gone through a process of consolidation and formalization, but which from a day-to-day perspective shouldn't mean any significant change in terms of how employers, how contractors, how designers engage with building control. Next slide then, please, Jess. The most important aspect, though, the changes introduced by the Building Safety Act through the building regs that I wanted to cover off in this afternoon session, concerns the duty holder role introduced through the building regs and the associated additional regulation introduced through the higher risk buildings regs. The building regs now define a range of different duty holders, and it's important for members to understand within the context of those duty holder roles which role or roles the member may fulfill from time to time in relation to any given project, and critically, what that duty holder role means in terms of duties and obligations. The starting point is that the building regs define the client, the building regs principal designer, the building regs principal contractor, any designer and any contractor. Now, thinking about those organisations that are likely to be represented on this call, a designer for the purposes of the building regs is not necessarily a designer in a traditional sense, such as an architect. It's any organisation which contributes design work to the delivery of a project. Design work is rather unhelpfully defined as the design of any building work. There is no exhaustive list. And so, in principle, any output produced by an organisation which informs the design, the specification of building work or products is likely to be determined to be design for the purposes of the building regs. I suspect then that there are service lines offered by members which probably are captured within that definition of design. I'm choosing my wording carefully because, of course, it may be that some members are providing surveys at an early stage only, and that is the extent of the organisation's involvement in delivery. In that case, there is probably a question as to whether or not the there is a design input which is being provided or not. Other members, though, I suspect, are providing services in relation to BIM, perhaps ad hoc input through the delivery of the design and construction phases, and are more likely then to stray into that design role. The design role applies by default if the relevant definition within the building regs is satisfied, and so the contractual matrix, the relationship that your organisation may have with its customer, is essentially irrelevant. If you are providing design for as defined within the building regs, then you are fulfilling a regulated role as a designer. In some circumstances, that could be the principal designer role, though I suspect that will infrequently be the case for members on this call. What does that mean, though? If an organisation is a designer for the purposes of the building regs, then since October 23, that means that in relation to any project, regardless of size or type of building, the organisation needs to have been competent to deliver the services that it has provided. It needs to have ensured that it's assessed the competence of any individuals within the organisation providing services, and also those who may be brought in as sub-consultants. And also then that the organisation has complied with a range of duties specific to the role of designer that apply throughout the duration of the project, and not therefore simply in relation to the defined provision of services at a point in time. The corresponding duties and obligations continue throughout the project. And the reason for that is to cover those instances where the designer might provide ad hoc input as the construction phase progresses through to completion. There's a lot that we could say around these duties. I don't have time to do so, save to flag that the duties now set out in the building regs focus on ensuring compliance with both design and carrying out of work with any relevant requirements of the building regulations, i.e. the functional requirements of the building regulations set out in parts A through S and the approved documents. It may then be the case that there are certain aspects of members' work that don't stray into defined aspects of regulation in the context of the building regulations. It may be that there are some aspects that are. The organisations that we work with are generally looking to mitigate the risk associated with non-compliance as far as possible. And so regardless of the fact that there may be a distinction as to what aspects of work are subject to functional requirements, the building regs, and which are not, organisations are typically just adopting a baseline standard for the policies, the processes, the systems, etc., that are being implemented to manage risk in relation to this, regardless of the nuances of which aspects of work are subject to a functional requirement and which are not. You can see from those sub-bullet points that the general duties are broadly straightforward. So every designer owes a duty to plan, manage and monitor works to ensure that the works, if built, will comply with all relevant requirements of the building regs, to cooperate with all other duty holders, again, to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements of the building regs, and further to provide information relevant to deliverables in relation to the project to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements of the building regs. There's also a duty to provide advice to the client as to whether or not specific work constitutes higher risk building work or not, but only if that advice is requested. There are then additional duties for the building regs principal designer and the building regs principal contractor, which essentially apply those same duties, not only in relation to the PD or the PC's own work, but in relation to all design or all building work in relation to the project. Next slide, please. Competence is something which has been heavily covered in the commentary and in the literature post the Building Safety Act coming into force. This slide here shows you what we know about what competence is from the perspective of the legislation and the building regs. It's from an individual's perspective, having the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours necessary to carry out design or building work in accordance with all relevant requirements of the building regulations. From an organisation's perspective, that's having the organisational capability to do so. Thinking about the members likely to be on this call then, and the organisation competence that the building regs require, that organisational capability is going to in itself be split into two parts. There's going to be the policies, the processes, the systems that are within the organisation itself to ensure the delivery of output that comply with all relevant requirements of the building regs. But sitting aside that is going to be still the individual capability, the capability of the people within the organisation to carry out work in accordance with those organisational processes, policies, systems, etc., to ensure all relevant requirements of the building regs are fulfilled in relation to the particular deliverable. Next slide, please, Jess. Competence then will look different for every individual, every organisation, depending on what their profession is, what role they're playing within the supply chain. And so that very broad definition within the regulations is necessary. There can't be one size fits all. Competence, though, is built around SCEB. So the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours relevant to the individual or the organisation. Competence needs to be project specific, so it needs to be demonstrated in relation to the specific requirements of the given project which is being undertaken. And that means that if organisationally you are employing sub-consultants, you need to be considering the competence of the sub-consultant in relation to the given project. That includes asking perhaps difficult questions around historic misconduct and sanctions that might have been imposed. And the organisations that we work with are generally addressing this by developing in-house competency packs, which can be passed upstream to the customer to demonstrate compliance across, to demonstrate competence rather, across a range of different project and sector types, and then developing downstream questionnaires that can be used to assess the competence of consultants and other third parties. At a point in the delivery of the project, the building regs principal designer and the building regs principal contractor will be required to give competence declarations in a fairly standard form. And what we're seeing is that whilst that is a regulatory requirement that sits with the PD and the PC, contractually that is being flowed downstream to be a back-to-back requirement for organisations such as members on this call lower in the supply chain. There are then a range of requirements that apply throughout the design and construction phase. These include in relation to the giving of notices, the notification of duty holders, the provision of fire safety information, and the giving again by the PD and the PC of declarations to confirm compliance with those corresponding requirements. Those requirements which have been in force as part of the building regs since 1st October 23 apply again regardless of project size or type. The additional requirements that apply in relation to HRBs, again in force since 1st October 23, albeit subject to some provisions in relation to transition, then impose additional regulations regarding building control approval. And you may in that context have heard of the Gateway 2 and the Gateway 3 processes, which are responsible for delaying the delivery of a range of HRBs. There are additional regulations in relation to change control, in relation to the golden thread of information, in relation to mandatory occurrence reporting. And again, we could probably spend an hour just considering those, but unfortunately don't have the time to do so today. Next slide, Jess, please. Now, why is all of this important in the context of our conversation with Lockton today? Critically, non-compliance with the duty holder obligations that I flagged a few slides ago, or with those ongoing requirements that apply during the design and construction phases of any project, can result in a range of organisational specific risks. So there will be always the contractual risk associated with non-compliance. If as an organisation, a member fails to comply with its duties, its obligations, or the requirements of the building regs, then that is likely to be a breach of the contract with the customer, and there may be commercial consequences that follow from that breach of contract. There is also, though, the organisational risk presented by enforcement by the Building Control Authority. During the life cycle of a project and up to 10 years post practical completion, the Building Control Authorities can effect a range of enforcement measures against any organisation within the project supply chain that may be considered to have failed to comply with its duties, its obligations, the requirements of the building regs in a procedural sense. The enforcement measures range from orders to stop work, orders to open up and remediate work, through to prosecution of both individuals and organisations. Uniquely in English law, and unprecedentedly at the time, the Building Safety Act has also introduced cross-organisational risk. The ability of the court in certain circumstances to take a liability incurred by one company or limited liability partnership and impose that liability on an associated company or LLP, which is under common control. In the simplest example then, a certain liability incurred by a subsidiary could be imposed as a liability of the subsidiary's parent company. As many on the call, I'm sure, who are part of organisations with a group structuring will appreciate, that is or was essentially unheard of in English law, but it is now a reality. There are checks and balances in place in relation to that, and the starting point is that only very few liabilities can be imposed in that way, but crucially, those liabilities include a liability arising under the Defective Premises Act, which Tim was talking about earlier, or a liability arising from a building safety risk, which is a fire or structural safety risk. And the good news doesn't just stop there, because there's also now provisions that go further than they ever did previously in relation to the risk of individuals within a commercial entity, and there are defined provisions within the Building Safety Act which allow for the prosecution of individuals in relation to offences committed by, say, a company, but where that offence was committed either with the active engagement of the individual or as a result of the negligence of the individual. So generally a failure to do something to stop the offence from occurring. Those offences include a failure to comply with the building regulations. And so the risk profile presented by that is perhaps quite real for organisations on this call. I think, though, conscious of the time, and without wanting to leave on too negative a note, we were keen to have time for questions. So I'll pause there and open the floor to any questions.
Thank you very much, Tim and Gavin. That was really insightful. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions at all? If you just put them in the chat box, or feel free to contact any of us afterwards if you want to take it offline as well. we'll just give everyone a few moments just in case.
It might be worth saying to Tim and Gavin, I think from our perspective as lowly insurance brokers working in the world of professional indemnity insurance, we've already seen certainly a couple of notifications, professional indemnity insurance notifications that stem from the DPA, so the Defective Premises Act, obviously the longer backstretching liability period. I think I'm right in saying that in both of our instances that I can think of, they've actually been contractors, I think. So I suppose just a wider question to yourselves, do you think that, given I suppose the audience makeup here, and I know we do have some contractors on the call as well as engineers, do you see, I suppose, any sort of likelihood in terms of contractors feeling the brunt more on all things, certainly with regards to the DPA, than design professionals, or should it equally, or could it equally affect both?
David, it's a good question. I think the in terms of who this is most likely to hit, I think a lot of it will go back to the structure of the original contract. So a lot of employers for years, design and build has been the most popular way of contracting. So yeah, your main contractors are most likely to get hit in the first instance, but of course what they will then do is they will seek to flow the claims down, and that's where anybody involved in the project is likely to get dragged in. So I think the initial claim or initial letter of claim or initial of or notice of a problem will go to the main contractor, but it will probably then all get flowed down, I would have thought. Gavin, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think all I was going to say was that the claims we've seen, regardless of the side of the table that we're on, the claim is being cast as widely as it possibly can to bring in all potential stakeholders who might be at risk in relation to the relevant design or build or whatever the issues might be. And that is the case even if the view is being taken that there might just be enough to establish a negotiating position to try and achieve some kind of commercial outcome, as opposed to perhaps having the intent of running a claim against all of these, this myriad of web of stakeholders, all the way through to arbitration or trial, as the case may be.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's another sort of, just whilst we're kicking a few things around, I think the other thing that's worth flagging is we were one of the issues that has come up in the case law, which I didn't pick up on because of time, is the courts have commented on the difficulty of, frankly, reading and properly understanding some of the relevant bits of the building regulations. So, for example, approved document B, etc. And this was something that came up in the Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry also, and it's worth flagging in that regard that there's a consultation taking place this autumn, which is going to look at the approach to regulation in this area. Obviously, we don't know how that will pan out, and we don't know what changes will be made, but it's worth flagging, I think, that there will be changes on the way, and it's important that if you are involved in the design of buildings, just to keep an eye on those changes and when they come into force, because I think there will be further changes on the way. And I think the intention is that those changes will make everything easier. But of course, the important bit is knowing about the existence of those changes and how to comply with them in the first place.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
The only other thing I suppose to mention is, again, something we were kicking around, I suppose, before we started on this webinar, was just linking it back to the professional indemnity insurance. I suppose at this stage we haven't seen insurers impose any special measures with regards to, for instance, the new principal designer role, and we've not seen any restrictions come in for any of the acts that we talk about today, nor have we seen premiums go up or rating go up. We were trying just sort of talking beforehand, and I think it's fair to say that insurers are reactionary. That may come, but at this stage, I don't think insurers see this as a concern. But the future claims landscape may or may not change that. So a lot of this actually just waits to be seen as far as the professional indemnity insurance market is concerned.
Yeah, I think so. I think again it comes back to what, for those on this webinar, I think the important bit, and again, Gavin, subject to your thoughts, is just understanding whether or not you've undertaken that role if you're working on a project where that's relevant. So I understood insurers aren't necessarily widening or they aren't addressing this expressly, but I think nevertheless in terms of liability it's important that people do understand whether or not they're taking on that role, and just make sure that's clear in your contract documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, thank you very much, Gavin. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Jess, as well. I didn't even thank you, did I?
No, you didn't.
Just
very
thank
rude.
Tim and Gavin. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Yeah, so these slides will be sent to you. I know our details are on there as well, so if you do think of any questions, do feel free to reach out. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.